A recent report has come out that prior to hiring James Gunn as the head of DC Studios, WB was eyeing a very divisive director to helm a follow-up to Man of Steel. All that and more in today's video. So, a recent report from The Wrap looked into the financials of what exactly Superman would need to make in order to be financially successful for Warner Brothers and DC. And in that article, they highlighted the downfall of the DCEU and its rebirth as the DCU under James Gunn. Now, I've always felt that James Gunn's DCU was kinda kneecapped by the decisions made towards the end of the DCEU. I think the biggest of which was bringing Henry Cavill back as Superman in the post-credit scene for Black Adam. Despite being an incredibly average movie and a box office bomb, that reveal in Black Adam set a very real expectation for fans of Zack Snyder's DC Universe and Henry Cavill Superman. The reality of getting a sequel to Man of Steel starring Henry Cavill only lasted a few weeks though, because as soon as James Gunn was brought in, it was abundantly clear that we were getting a full reboot. Now, I've always liked Henry Cavill as Superman. I thought he did a decent job with the material he was given, and yeah, I was interested in seeing a follow-up to Man of Steel, but the state of the DCEU at this point was so all over the place that I didn't mind that we were getting a full reboot. And I was really glad that the main creative behind this universe was somebody whose other work I have really enjoyed, especially his DC projects. The Suicide Squad was probably the best movie in the DCEU, and Peacemaker was my favorite superhero-related material released in 2022. It had been nearly 10 years since Henry Cavill's big screen debut as the Man of Steel. Compare that to DC's biggest competitor with the MCU. If we think of Clark Kent as the Tony Stark figure of the DCEU, Robert Downey Jr. was getting ready to retire the character by this point in his career. Yes, Henry Cavill was excited to continue playing Superman, but I think he much prefers his new role that he got right off the back of losing Superman. Cavill is going to be executive producing and starring in a Warhammer 40,000 TV show, which is one of his favorite franchises. And with his Justice League co-star Jason Momoa taking on the role of Lobo in the new DCU, I think there's a role for Henry Cavill in there somewhere if he really wanted to come back. I've been saying it for over 2 years, but get that guy in there as Bruce Wayne. But we're here to talk about the potential sequel to Man of Steel that was never made. Now, a true Man of Steel 2 was never officially announced. Keep in mind that Batman v Superman was announced the month after Man of Steel released in theaters. So most of the attention was on these two iconic heroes meeting up on the big screen for the first time rather than another solo Superman movie. But following the release of Batman v Superman and Zack Snyder leaving Justice League during post-production, fans began talking about how bad they wanted to see a sequel to Man of Steel. George Miller was a heavily desired director from fans. Matthew Vaughn, the director of the Kingsman movies, was the top choice from Warner Brothers. Mission Impossible director Christopher McQuarrie teamed up with Henry Cavill to pitch their own sequel. And following his brief firing from Marvel Studios, James Gunn was even sought after to direct a Superman sequel. He instead decided to make the Suicide Squad, which, if we're looking at it in hindsight, much better decision on his part. And WB was even interested in doing an Elseworld Superman movie. A Red Sun movie was rumored to be in development at one point, along with a very different take on Superman pitched by J.J. Abrams and Michael B. Jordan. Following Justice League though, it seemed like Henry Cavill wasn't really interested in coming back as Superman, or at least wasn't asked. There's a brief Superman cameo in Shazam that crops out his face, and at the time Henry Cavill was more focused on roles like The Witcher. But by 2022, DC was in a really rough state. Birds of Prey was positively received but was a box office bomb. Wonder Woman 1984 was negatively received, and was the first WB movie to be simultaneously released on HBO Max and in theaters, leading to it also being a box office bomb. Then there was The Suicide Squad, which received rave reviews, but because it was 2021 and simultaneously released on HBO Max and in theaters, it too was a box office bomb. And then in 2022, we had the release of Peacemaker, which received very positive reviews. The Batman, which wasn't even a part of the DC Extended Universe, but it was the first financial and critical success DC had seen in quite some time. And we also had all of the overhead at WB changing hands, which led to the cancellation of the nearly completed Batgirl. DC was spiraling, so they were pitching any idea that could could potentially work at this point. This is where they got back in talks with Henry Cavill, somebody they knew fans really wanted to see on the big screen again. And having burned a bridge with Zack Snyder, they went after the closest thing they could find, which is what we found out yesterday. Director Michael Bay was being considered by WB to be the frontrunner to direct a Man of Steel sequel in 2022. Now, I've seen a lot of people exaggerate this story and say that a Michael Bay Superman movie with Henry Cavill in the lead was nearly made. That's not the case though. The story is only that Michael Bay was the director that WB wanted to helm the film. A deal was never made, and as far as we know, Michael Bay was never even asked. But I don't think he would have said yes even if he was. In that same year, he said, "It's not that I'm not interested in Marvel. As Ridley Scott says, the most complicated thing for a director and the most fun thing for a director is to build the world. I'm not the guy to go into Lucas's Star Wars and do Star Wars 5. That's not me. I'm not the one to come into Iron Man 7. I'm not the one to do Batman 10. I want to do my own thing. I would love to do a superhero thing, but I would want it to be on my own terms and create my own world." And that kind of tracks with everything he's done with the Transformers franchise. I would never consider myself an expert on the Transformers franchise as a whole. I'm more of a pedestrian than anything in that franchise. But I know that Bay's interpretation for many of those characters does not line up with some of the G1 or expanded universe Transformers canon. He basically just took the general idea of Transformers and built upon it himself. And I'm also aware that those movies and that universe has their own group of fans, which, hey, like what you like, I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't like. But with movies, I feel like the general perspective is that Transformers got worse with each subsequent entry that Michael Bay was directing. I go to see movies all the time, good and bad, and I think the only time I've ever considered walking out of a theater was when I saw Age of Extinction. But I do feel like Michael Bay can make really good movies. His most recent release, Ambulance, was pretty solid. I think Pain and Gain is generally a pretty underrated movie, but Michael Bay is just extremely easy to rag on. His decisions are mostly style over substance. The excessive explosions and use of slow motion with Dutch angles, he works best when somebody is restraining a lot of those tendencies. But he's a director that would be pretty comparable to Zack Snyder, who I know also has his own fans, but I feel like his movies are mostly style over substance, especially if you look at his original IPs like Sucker Punch and Rebel Moon. But would Bay be the worst thing to happen to Superman? Definitely not. If you've seen Superman 4, you know that there's not much worse that you could do beyond that. But I still don't feel like he would have been the right choice to make a great Superman movie. He was probably a decent choice to make a follow-up to Man of Steel, but I think a lot of the things that people wanted to see in a Man of Steel sequel, Michael Bay just wouldn't have been able to deliver. And overall, I've said it before, I'm glad that WB made the decision to let James Gunn be the new guiding light of the DC universe. That's gonna do it for this video though. Let me know in the comments down below which movie you would have preferred seeing. The soon-to-be released James Gunn Superman movie, or a Michael Bay follow-up of Man of Steel 2. While some may feel the choice is obvious, I think there's going to be a lot of debate of what people would have rather seen. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.